Clarissa Miles thought she had the perfect life: 2 beautiful children, a devoted husband, and the respect of an entire church. But when Pastor Franklin Miles discovered through a secret DNA test that neither child was biologically his, the man once praised for his faith snapped and buried the truth along with his wife beneath their basement floor. Pastor Franklin Miles was the kind of man people trusted without question. In the close-knit neighborhoods of Chicago's South Side, his presence was almost sacred. He had led the Greater Hope Baptist Church for over a decade, a modest congregation housed in a red brick building with a white steeple that had weathered countless seasons. People came to him for advice, comfort, and direction. He baptized their babies, blessed their marriages, and preached funerals with dignity. To many, he wasn't just a pastor. He was a moral compass, a father figure, and a symbol of integrity. Franklin lived in a quiet cul-de-sac with his wife Clarissa and their 2 children, Noah and Ava. Their home looked like something out of a church calendar photo: neatly trimmed hedges, a bright blue door, and an American flag waving gently on the porch. Clarissa, a former choir director, had met Franklin at a church conference when they were both in their early 20s. Their love story was one people admired: 2 devout souls finding each other in the house of God, building a life together based on faith and commitment. They were married within a year and welcomed Noah shortly after, followed by Ava 2 years later. Clarissa was as involved in the community as her husband. She led prayer groups, helped organize charity drives, and was always the first to bring a casserole when a neighbor fell ill. She was beautiful in a quiet, graceful way, with an easy smile and a calming presence. The children were well-behaved and always dressed in pressed clothes for Sunday service. Franklin often referenced them during sermons: how Noah wanted to be a doctor, how Ava loved to read the Psalms before bed. The churchgoers loved these small windows into the pastor's private life. To them, the Miles family was the embodiment of Christian virtue, but Franklin's world had subtle cracks, ones that only he noticed at first. He never spoke of them, not even to Clarissa. It began with a strange unease he couldn't shake. Small observations that didn't sit right. Noah had light brown eyes, even though both Franklin and Clarissa had dark ones. Ava once needed a blood transfusion during a tonsillectomy, and the nurse mentioned something about her blood type being unusual given the parents' types. The moment passed, quickly buried beneath polite laughter and medical confusion. But it stayed with Franklin. He didn't want to believe his thoughts. He told himself it was stress, paranoia, maybe even the devil tempting him to doubt his blessings. So he prayed harder, worked longer hours, and forced himself to drown out the unease. Still, the questions returned. Little things: a photo Clarissa kept hidden in her drawer, just a small snapshot of her with a man Franklin didn't recognize, a whisper he overheard once at a funeral: "Clarissa's boy doesn't look like him at all." Most of the time he would ignore it, but sometimes, when he was alone late at night, he'd sit in the living room with the lights off and stare at the photos on the mantel, searching the children's faces for pieces of himself. Clarissa never gave him any reason to doubt her. She was affectionate, supportive, always by his side. If she was hiding something, she did it with remarkable skill. But that only deepened Franklin's torment. He began to question his own perception. Could he be imagining this? Was he simply tired, overworked, and letting his mind betray him? The tipping point came unexpectedly. One afternoon, Noah came home from school with a scrape on his forehead. It wasn't serious, but they took him to the hospital for safety. The nurse made a casual comment about Noah's blood type during intake. It struck Franklin like a hammer to the chest. He smiled and nodded as she spoke, but inside something split wide open. He couldn't ignore it anymore. The math didn't work. The genetics didn't add up. The doubts weren't whispers. They were sirens now, screaming at him to confront the truth. When they returned home that night, Franklin sat alone in his car for an hour. Clarissa was inside, making dinner, the kids playing in the yard. From the outside, everything looked perfect, but for Franklin, perfection had become a mask, one that was about to be ripped off, exposing the betrayal he feared more than anything else. Franklin waited until the house was empty one afternoon to quietly order the DNA test online. He chose the most discreet packaging option and paid extra for express shipping. The kit arrived 2 days later in a plain white envelope that blended in with the day's mail. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it, carefully reading the instructions over and over. He took the samples from himself and the children while Clarissa was out running errands. The kids thought it was just a fun science project. They laughed and made faces as he swabbed their mouths, completely unaware of the storm forming just beneath his calm expression. He mailed the samples the next morning and began the agonizing wait. Each day felt like a slow, suffocating crawl. He moved through his routines like a man half awake, preaching on Sundays, attending prayer circles, visiting sick members of the church, yet inside he was unraveling. Every smile Clarissa gave him felt fake. Every innocent word from Noah or Ava stung. He found himself staring at the children longer than usual, trying to see signs of truth or deception etched into their faces. He wondered how long Clarissa had known. Had she lied to him every day, every night? Had her entire life with him been a carefully constructed illusion? The results arrived 11 days later. He opened the email in his office, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The message was brief and clinical, no emotion, just data. But the words hit him like a physical blow. Probability of paternity, 0%. For both children, not one, both. Franklin sat frozen for what felt like hours. The office grew dark as the sun dipped below the horizon, but he didn't move. He couldn't. The truth had landed with the weight of 1,000 sermons. His entire life had been built around a lie. The woman he had loved, trusted, and praised from the pulpit had betrayed him in the most intimate, devastating way imaginable. And the children, the ones he'd raised, held, fed, prayed for, they were not his, not by blood. Something broke inside him that night. It wasn't anger at first. It was grief, a deep, bottomless sorrow. He cried alone in the church office, face buried in his hands, muffling the sobs so no one would hear. He felt robbed, humiliated. He wondered how many people around him had known or suspected and simply said nothing. What kind of fool had he been? But grief gave way to fury. Slowly, quietly. Over the next few days, Franklin began to replay every moment of their marriage through a new lens. Every kiss, every compliment, every shared glance now felt poisoned. He searched Clarissa's social media, scrolled through old photos, emails, messages, looking for clues, for names, for men. He found nothing definitive, but that only deepened the madness. The possibility that she could hide something this massive without a single crack showing terrified him. And what terrified him, he began to hate. Franklin ordered a second test, then a third. Each one returned the same brutal truth. There was no mistake, no lab error, no mercy. It was real. Clarissa had deceived him. Not once, but twice. 2 children, 2 lives, and for 11 years she had pretended. He couldn't confront her, not yet. Every time he looked at her, his mind raced with questions he couldn't voice. His sermons became darker, more intense. He spoke more often of sin, betrayal, and judgment. Church members noticed the shift but chalked it up to stress. He smiled less, slept less, ate less, but he planned more. He became consumed with the idea of justice, not the kind preached from the pulpit, but a more personal, unforgiving kind. In his mind, Clarissa had not only lied, she had stolen from him. His identity, his legacy, his trust. And the longer he sat with that truth, the more he became convinced that God would not be the one to deliver judgment. It was a chilly Friday afternoon when Clarissa disappeared. The sun was bright, but the air had that early spring bite. the kind that made the neighborhood feel quieter than usual. Clarissa told the kids she was heading to the store and would be back in time for dinner. She never returned. Hours passed, and Franklin calmly told Noah and Ava their mother had been delayed. When night fell, he tucked them into bed and told them not to worry. Mommy would call soon, but deep down, he knew there would be no call. Clarissa was already gone. The truth lay beneath their very feet, hidden in the basement of the house that once echoed with laughter and hymns. Franklin had spent weeks planning. He had poured a new section of concrete a few days prior, telling neighbors it was to fix a plumbing issue. In reality, it was part of a carefully constructed trap. He'd lured Clarissa downstairs that morning with a believable excuse, something about water damage near the furnace. She followed, unsuspecting, still wearing her church volunteer sweatshirt. She never made it back up the stairs. Franklin struck her from behind with a heavy wrench. It took more than one blow. His hands shook, not from remorse, but from the sheer weight of what he was doing. Clarissa collapsed instantly, her body crumpling in a heap. There was no struggle, no screams. It was over in minutes. He stood over her body, breathing hard, drenched in sweat and guilt he couldn't name yet. Then he got to work. Plastic sheets, gloves, bleach he had researched thoroughly. The new concrete was poured with precision, covering her final resting place beneath what now looked like a small storage section. It was clean, cold, and hidden, just as he wanted it. The days that followed were a master class in performance. Franklin told the children Clarissa had gone to visit her cousin in Michigan for a short break. He fabricated text messages, sent updates from her phone, and even staged a brief phone call using a pre-recorded voice app to assure Ava that Mommy is fine. To the outside world, Franklin was a grieving but composed husband, doing his best to maintain normalcy for the sake of his kid. He preached that Sunday, with tears in his eyes, using the absence of Clarissa as a sermon point on faith and patience. The congregation responded with sympathy, unaware that the man speaking was now a murderer. But keeping up the lie proved harder than Franklin anticipated. Clarissa's sister, Monica, grew concerned quickly. She and Clarissa spoke nearly every day, and the sudden silence was out of character. Monica tried calling repeatedly, only to get short, vague texts in return. Something didn't feel right. She drove to the house 2 weeks later and demanded to know what was going on. Franklin, calm as ever, said Clarissa needed space. She just needs to clear her head, he said. Monica left uneasy, but she had no proof something was wrong, at least not yet. Still, the pressure mounted. Church members whispered about Clarissa's extended absence. The children began asking more questions, their mother's prolonged silence unsettling. Franklin grew more withdrawn, obsessively checking and rechecking the basement for signs of exposure. He became irritable, paranoid, barely sleeping. The calm pastor mask began to slip, especially when Monica filed a missing persons report with the Chicago PD. Detectives visited the house and asked routine questions. Franklin answered them all with the steady confidence of a seasoned public speaker. But police noticed small inconsistencies. Why wasn't there a missing persons poster? Why hadn't Franklin called Clarissa's job to explain her absence? Why was her car still in the driveway? The basement, when they asked to see it, smelled faintly of chemicals. The fresh cement patch stood out. Franklin explained it away as minor home repairs, but the officers made a note of it. When cadaver dogs were later brought in for a follow-up search, they reacted strongly to the concrete slab. That was the moment everything started to unravel. The pastor's house of lies was beginning to crack. The basement floor was no longer just a renovation detail. It had become the focal point of an intensifying investigation. After the cadaver dogs signaled with urgency near the recently poured concrete, detectives grew suspicious. They requested a warrant to perform a more thorough search of the property. Franklin tried to maintain his composure, offering nervous smiles and rehearsed explanations, but the detectives had seen too many lies before. His calm was starting to look rehearsed, too perfect, too controlled. The warrant was approved within 48 hours. Early one morning, investigators returned with a forensic team, ground-penetrating radar, and a team of excavation specialists. The children had already been placed in temporary protective custody after child welfare officials were notified. Authorities feared they were living in a home with potential violence even before they uncovered the truth. Franklin stood quietly in his living room as officers and technicians marched through his house, cameras recording every inch. His hands were clenched behind his back, his jaw tight. He said nothing. He did not resist. In the basement, the team began breaking through the new slab. The scent that rose from the cracks in the cement was undeniable. The forensic experts paused and exchanged glances, already knowing what they were about to find. It didn't take long. Beneath the concrete was a hastily dug grave, wrapped in layers of plastic sheeting and sealed with duct tape. Clarissa Miles' body was uncovered, her face bruised, her arms curled in a defensive position. The coroner's initial examination confirmed what many had already feared. Clarissa had died from multiple blunt force traumas to the head. Her hands showed clear signs of defensive wounds. This was no accident. It was a brutal, deliberate killing. Blood spatter analysis in the space around the grave suggested she had been attacked in the same room. There had been no effort to move her elsewhere or stage a disappearance. There was no effort to move her elsewhere or stage a disappearance. It was cold, it was calculated, it was final. Detectives confronted Franklin with the findings. At first he denied everything. He insisted Clarissa had left and must have come back while he was out. He claimed he found her dead and panicked. The lie fell apart within minutes. Investigators showed him the results of her autopsy. Then, they showed him the data from the DNA tests they had discovered in his church office. 3 separate paternity tests, each showing he was not the biological father of Noah or Ava. Faced with the undeniable evidence, Franklin finally broke. Not with a confession, but with silence. He said nothing more after that moment. His attorney quickly advised him to say no more and wait for trial. But it didn't matter. The evidence told the story better than he ever could. In the weeks that followed, investigators uncovered Franklin's internet history, full of searches related to paternity fraud, how to dispose of a body, and how to hide DNA results from. They found a hidden journal in his office drawer, its pages filled with entries that painted a picture of a man slowly consumed by suspicion, betrayal, and a thirst for vengeance. He had meticulously planned the killing, the purchase of the cement, the rental of tools, the use of burner phones. Everything was documented in receipts, timestamps, and surveillance footage. Franklin, the man who once preached about forgiveness and compassion, had methodically built a tomb for his wife beneath their family home. The same house where their children played, the same basement where he once held Bible studies. The church congregation was devastated. Shock turned into disbelief, then horror. The man they had once looked to for moral guidance had murdered his wife in cold blood. Clarissa's funeral was held 3 weeks after the discovery of her body. It was packed with mourners, but Franklin wasn't there. He sat alone in a county jail cell, awaiting trial, surrounded not by the prayers of a congregation, but by the cold hum of fluorescent lights, and the heavy silence of a life destroyed. But the damage wasn't just limited to Franklin's reputation. 2 children were now without parents. A community had been betrayed. And the city of Chicago had witnessed yet another headline that blurred the line between faith and violence, trust and tragedy. Franklin Miles's trial became one of the most closely followed cases in Chicago that year. The once revered pastor who had stood behind pulpits preaching virtue and faith now stood behind a bulletproof glass divider in an orange jumpsuit, his hands shackled, his eyes hollow. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, former church members, Clarissa's friends, and even strangers, drawn by the bizarre mix of religion, betrayal, and murder. The man once praised for his moral compass was now being judged for the darkest betrayal imaginable. Prosecutors presented their case with surgical precision. They laid out the timeline, the motive, the physical evidence, and the digital trail Franklin had left behind. The DNA test results were key to the narrative. They showed the moment Franklin's perception of his family shattered. The state painted a portrait of a man so obsessed with legacy, so consumed by betrayal, that he turned to murder instead of truth. Every step had been deliberate. Ordered DNA tests, premeditated burial preparations, staged text messages, and the systematic lying to everyone, including his own children. Clarissa's voice echoed through the courtroom in other ways. Through her sister Monica's tearful testimony, through photos of her vibrant presence in the community, through messages she had exchanged with friends. Prosecutors emphasized how she had trusted Franklin, even loved him to the end, never suspecting that the man she shared a home with was preparing to bury her beneath it. The defense attempted to argue emotional distress. They called experts to testify that the psychological trauma of discovering the children were not his had created a temporary break in Franklin's reasoning. They suggested he acted in a state of deep emotional disturbance, triggered by a betrayal that shook the foundation of his identity. But the jury was unmoved. There was no evidence of temporary madness, only months of planning, calculated steps, and a meticulous cover-up. His journal alone refuted the defense. In it he wrote not like a man broken, but like a man coldly determined to right what he believed was a divine injustice. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for just under 4 hours. They returned with a unanimous verdict: guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, obstruction of justice, and abuse of a corpse. Franklin showed no reaction, no tears, no outrage. He simply stood still as the sentence was read: life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict sent ripples through the community. Greater Hope Baptist Church, once the pride of the South Side, closed its doors within a month. The congregation had scattered, many unable to return to the sanctuary that now felt stained by deception and blood. The church building stood empty, its windows boarded up, a haunting monument to what had once been considered holy ground. The greatest tragedy, however, was left for Noah and Ava. The children were moved into the custody of Clarissa's relatives in Georgia. They had lost both parents in a single, unimaginable act. Neither was old enough to fully grasp the depth of what had happened, but they understood enough to know life would never be the same. Therapists were assigned, guardianship papers filed. Their last memory of their father was the day he kissed them on the forehead and told them everything would be okay, knowing full well that their mother was already dead. In the aftermath, journalists and commentators debated what drove a man like Franklin to kill. Was it pride? Betrayal? The shattering of identity? Some saw him as a cautionary tale of ego masked as righteousness. Others saw a monster hiding behind a cross. But none of the debates could undo what had been done. Clarissa was dead. Her children were broken. A church was gone. And Franklin Miles, once seen as a pillar of faith, would live out his remaining days in a cell, a forgotten man, imprisoned not just by walls, but by the truth he couldn't bear to live with.